Chapter 7, the Romans' High Empire. And there are few emperors at this time, but we're looking at three in particular: Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. So the High Empire begins with the rule of Nerva, who we've already mentioned, and then the Spanish emperors Trajan and Hadrian, and it ends with Commodus from the Antonine dynasty. And we, as I said, are looking specifically at Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. We've already looked at the slide, but just as a reminder, Domitian, right, still from the early empire, asked to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And of course, that angered the senators, and so he was assassinated in 96 AD. Nerva ushers in the High Empire. He is an elderly individual chosen by the Senate to rule for and he rules for 16 months. One of his biggest things that he offers the Roman world at this time, it's a very strategic move, is this idea of a pattern of succession by adoption, because he realizes that the lack of having an heir, the lack of an actual protocol for who will be next has been harming the empire. And so he adopts Trajan, and actually we're told requires or asks Trajan to adopt somebody, and Trajan will adopt Hadrian. Alright, so Trajan, he is adopted by Nerva, right? So after Nerva's death, Trajan comes to power in 98 AD. He is our first non-Italian to rule Rome. Really important to make a note of that. Our first non-Italian to rule Rome. He's actually born in Spain. So because that's kind of like the first non-US citizen, non-US born individual or citizen becoming president. Like that's what's happening in Rome at this time. So, what other things do we know about Trajan? Well, he was granted the title Optimus, like the best. So they loved him. This is really important, right? The imperial power has reestablished public favor, so they love him. He believed that the imperial government has to take more responsibility for the people's welfare. So he began instituting different social programs that would be beneficial to the individuals. Also, Trajan took Roman rule to more distant areas and lands, and one of his greatest campaigns was against the Dacians, and we'll talk about them in just a second with another slide. So he did have several military campaigns, and that is what expanded the Roman Empire. Now when historians look back at the High Empire, and they say that under Trajan, Hadrian, and the Antonines, the Roman world reached its largest geographic extent and the height of its power. So that's the moment that we're in, that's the moment that we're looking at. One other quick kind of a fun fact about Trajan, what we're told is that he was the one who introduced the concept of innocent until proven guilty. Basically because he felt that it was better that a guilty man go unpunished than an innocent man be punished. I know this is not on your info sheet, but I just wanted to put it in there for you to see yet another emperor who is constructing an arch. And in this case, of course, we see a much more sculptural relief decorations all over it as well. But I'm just putting it in there just to kind of reinforce this idea of emperors building, commemorating their victories, and using these common forms like the arch all the time. The next object on your info sheet is the column of Trajan, but we need to contextualize it. We need to know where it's located. And so this is the Forum of Trajan. Now, forums are really, really important in Rome, in ancient Rome, because it was basically it served a few functions. It was kind of a marketplace, in a public square. It was a place for judicial and business affairs. It was a place of gathering of the people, kind of an assembly of the people. Sometimes, as in this case, it'd be the libraries and the temple. Now, one important thing about the temple in this image, which is indicated as number 1, that one was built with the next emperor, Hadrian, to commemorate the divine Trajan. So Trajan does become deified because they did love him, right? He was called Optimus. And so Hadrian, in honor of Trajan, builds that temple. But take a look at this place, and you want to imagine it kind of bustling with lots of people all the time. I mean, they're coming to the Basilica or the Forum, they're walking around the equestrian statue, they're coming to the libraries, Greek and Latin libraries that are on either side of that column. So it's a busy space. And it's in that space where he puts up this column, indicated here with the red arrow. Going back to our model of the city, we see where this forum and specifically the star indicates the column. So you see where it is, you see a kind of the Roman world expanding and growing with all these monuments and structures. Okay, let's look at some of the fun facts about this column of Trajan. First of all, one thing I just want to mention before we look at this list is think about that this narrative is covering the shaft of a column. This was a new idea. Normally, columns are holding up buildings, but in this case, it's standing alone and merely holds this powerful narrative about the Dacian encounter. So, it's a campaign against the Dacians, and that's basically kind of modern day Romania. He had two campaigns there in 101 AD and 105 AD, and Dacia became a Roman province in 106 AD. So, in other words, he did successfully end up conquering it. So, that victory is what this column commemorates, and it was dedicated in 112 AD. It's 128 feet high, 150 episodes with 2,500 figures. You guys wrap your head around that just for a second. How many powerful episodes are depicted on this column? There are 19 drums of marble placed one on top of the other, and if you were to unwind it, kind of a theoretically, symbolically unwinding it, it would be 625 feet. And that circles 23 times all the way around this column. A couple of stylistic terms, continuous narrative and horror vacui. These art historical terms. Continuous narrative means the same person appears two or more times. And we know that because Trajan appears all the time in this pictorial frame. And the second one, horror vacui, you've heard of this one before as well, is the fear of empty space. And certainly that is one of the features of this column. Now the base of the column that you're looking at, that square base, that is actually Trajan's tomb. Now, this went against any kind of social taboos because burial did not occur normally within the city limits. However, they got it approved because, Trajan was so loved and admired that they approved that this would eventually be his burial site. Next point there, the carving process. This is really, really challenging, you guys, because the stonemasons, first of all, had to create the marble drums. Okay, so it's pieces of marble created in this form, and they would hollow it out because ultimately, at the very end of it, of the structure, they would have a spiral staircase that would go the entire length of that column shaft. So after they created the drums of marble, it's placed on top of one another, and then they would have been carving from the top down, so in case they dropped anything, it wouldn't damage what they've already created. Also, they carved it once it was set in place because they wanted to make sure that it was continuous. In other words, it wasn't 19 different stories that were coming together in place with no kind of link between them. Last point is a nude sculpture of Trajan was placed on top of this. And in the 16th century, that was changed to an image of St. Peter. But at the time of its, which is what you see here, but at the time of its original construction, it was a nude sculpture of their powerful emperor right at the very top. This is one of the details of the reliefs on this column, and in this case we have the battle scene. So here's what's interesting about this whole monument. Only 1/4 of the frieze comprise of battle scenes. Not the whole thing. I mean, remember how many episodes there were? Only 1/4 of those are battle scenes, and you see them pretty fierce here. What's really relevant as well is that the enemy is not belittled. Right, they are still strong and fierce. In other words, in a sense, they've been presented as honorable and powerful enemy warriors. Here is another example of a battle scene. So it was a pretty fierce battle. In other words, this wasn't a very easy victory for the Romans, right? They had to have two military campaigns until eventually Dacia did become part of the Roman provinces. And then, of course, we see the brutality of the Roman Empire, and here we have the beheaded Dacians, and their heads are being presented to Emperor Trajan standing there up on the pedestal. So, again, Trajan is there. Much of the focus of the sculptural relief on this column is on Trajan and his ability and his power and his maneuvering of tactical, information and so on. So he is certainly the focus. But we also see, that vicious Roman Empire. What do they do with the enemies? They're literally cutting off their heads. Here we have the wounded Romans, and that's important because it tells us that they acknowledge that they were also getting hurt, and you have fellow soldiers helping one another with their injuries. So the scenes acknowledge that, the Romans were being injured. It wasn't that it was all about the Dacians and they were the ones whose heads were beheaded and nothing ever happened to the Romans. So it does acknowledge that the Romans also were paying a price for this victory. Here we see the fort construction, and just as it's true with modern military operations, the Romans also, they spent more time constructing forts, transporting men and equipment, and preparing for battle than actually fighting it. And that's why this column is so relevant, because it does that. Only 1/4 of the scenes are battle scenes. Everything else is all the extras, all the other important events that went into a military campaign. So I wanted to kind of back out a little bit, and you can see the fort construction that register at the top, but then the lower side of it you can see the god Neptune, right? So the gods were really an important part of this, and we know that they were having to make sacrifices to the gods throughout the military campaign, and you can see how Neptune has been presented here with hierarchic scale, right? Much larger and more powerful than the Roman soldiers as well. I just wanted you to see a few other details here of the Roman soldiers crossing the rivers, getting ready to attack, and just preparing, right? So, in other words, it wasn't just battle scenes. We're seeing all the preparation and all the motions to the ultimate battles and eventually victory. Okay, so the column significance. Now, this is just like when I ask you about what's the thesis, what's the main point, what's the big idea. That's what we're doing here as well. So let's look at these points. First of all, it celebrates the emperor's military valor, right? It celebrates his virtues. Remember, we looked at that with the Arch of Titus as well, right? It celebrates Titus's virtues. Same point here. Especially because most of the military narrative focuses on the emperor. He appears again and again and again. Second bullet here, it's a record of their military campaign. Now notice, it's not just a record of the fighting or the battle scenes, but a record of the campaign. It shows us how the Roman army looked, what its equipment was like, how it worked, how they set up the forts, all kinds of these details that were part of it. Now, we even saw marching soldiers. They're setting up camp. They're crossing the river. The emperor is addressing his troops. They have to make sacrifices to the gods. Eventually, we see the decapitated Dacian heads. And then finally, which we didn't see, but the Dacian ambassador is submitting to Trajan. So it's a record of the entire campaign. And finally, it's a record, or it shows us that the Romans won because of their organizational ability. It was superior. Not because they were inherently superior, but their ability to organize this powerful army, to set up camp, to go forward, to kind of go through the motions. That was why they won. At least that's the message we would have received from something like this. I know, what is this doing here? Was actually a column at the Northwich Mall, and then one time a few years ago I walked in and I saw that it had been converted to yet another surface for, I'm going to call it propaganda, right? It's an advertisement. And what's interesting is I'm standing at the same vantage point, but the thing itself is moving. So it's really good for lazy consumers. So again, you guys, I mean, look around, like look at the world around you. What else do you see? Where else do you see people trying to get you to buy things, do things, vote a certain way? I mean, it is happening all the time. Our visual propaganda is also very much active and alive. It may not be the exact method or the exact formula for what the Romans were doing. I mean, it doesn't look exactly the same, but the idea is still there. They want you to make a certain action, make a certain decision. So I just wanted to share this because, again, it's a column that was holding up this ceiling here, and then now the column has been converted into an advertising location. Trajan is followed by Hadrian, and Hadrian was Trajan's chosen successor, and he is also a fellow Spaniard. Now, he's born in Rome, but his family is originally from Spain. So here we have two, what we call kind of non-Italian emperors who are ruling Rome. A few things about Hadrian. He's a connoisseur and a lover of the arts. He's an author and he's an architect. So, what a cultured, well rounded emperor. He also loved Greek culture, traveled many times over there, including visiting Athens 3 times. So, already in your mind, you must be thinking he wants to make connections to ancient Athens. Again, just like Trajan, Hadrian was also loved. Everywhere that he went, people were setting up statues in his honor. He ruled for about 2 decades and what is considered one of Rome's greatest emperors and imperial moments. He increased the empire to its largest extent, and he had a peaceful empire. So, granted, he's attacking and kind of conquering other areas and taking up more geographic space, but within the empire, he did bring about peace. So here we have the portrait of Hadrian alongside the one of Pericles. I just wanted to insert this in here because we mentioned how Hadrian loved Greek art and Greek culture and traveled to Athens a few times. And we also believe that he had an admiration for the Greek beard that we see here with Pericles, and then Greek philosophers would have also had it. And so when Hadrian comes back, we're noticing that he pretty much sets the tone and the norm for emperors to be depicted with beards. So he is the first emperor that wears a full beard, and then the beard becomes a norm, as you'll see in the sculptures of the emperors coming up. And what's interesting is he was actually called the Greekling because he admired Greek culture so much, and this is a great example to show you that connection. I also like to show these two together because one of the things Hadrian was doing was evoking and reviving the era of Augustus. And I think this image of the portrait bust of Hadrian as a general is very similar in terms of kind of the form and posture to the Augustus general that we've already seen. And so you can see the cuirass, right, in Hadrian's case seems like it's depicting a battle of some sort, and then his right arm extended. I mean, it's broken off now, but it would have been extended very similar to what Augustus is doing as well. And we also know that in the kind of youthful representation of the images, Hadrian seemed to be reviving the classicism that was associated with Augustus. So a few connections to Augustus, and we'll see another one in just a few moments. And this was Hadrian's major undertaking, or, one of those major building projects that we've talked about. Now, Pantheon, the name means all the gods. So this was a temple built to all the gods. The temple is actually attributed to Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, and you can see that the M Agrippa in the inscription right there on the facade. So, just as a reminder about who Agrippa was, he was a lifelong friend of Augustus. He joined him at the outset of his career. He had a role to play in the Battle of Actium, we've mentioned, also involved in many military commands under Augustus. So, a really powerful figure, married to Augustus's daughter, and basically what we mentioned earlier was that he was a co-emperor with Augustus. Now, this temple was built under Marcus Agrippa, but it seems to have been destroyed in the fire during Nero's reign in 64 AD. And then in the process of being rebuilt again, there was another fire under Domitian's reign, and that seems to have destroyed it as well. So what is Hadrian doing here by keeping the facade of the original, by keeping that inscription there? Well, what we believe is that he wants to associate himself with the reign of Augustus. So he attributes the temple to Marcus Agrippa and connects himself to the reign of Augustus. Why would he do that? You guys remember this. Augustus created a period of peace and prosperity. That was his message. That was his mission. That was what he wanted to reinforce in the people's minds. So could it be that Hadrian wants to make the same kind of association? We believe so, very likely. Now, the building that you're looking at, the Pantheon, had two functions. It was both a religious building and a civic building. As a religious building, we've already mentioned, it was a monument to all the gods. And this is what makes it different from outside, from other temples, is not just that it's to all the gods, but also worship took place inside. What we've seen so far is worship taking place outside. Now again, we don't know which gods exactly would have been worshipped here, but we do know that worship is taking place inside. The second function of this building is a civic function. It was an imperial audience hall. This is where Hadrian would meet with the Senate. So you're seeing the same site, the same location, serving a religious and a civic function. You guys, this is so different from what we have in our culture of the religion, of the separation of church and state. In Rome, that was not the case, right? The emperor was the Pontifex Maximus, was the chief priest of their religion. So it's not unusual that they would think of this thing, the same building housing two different kinds of functions. And then when you look at the facade, it looks like a normal temple. You've got the pediment, a bit of a porch there, the podium, the columns. It looks like a normal temple. But is it really just a regular Roman temple? And of course, we always want to find ourselves on the model of the city plan, and there we are with a yellow star indicated in the top left of the image. That's where the Pantheon was built. So here's a Roman temple we looked at earlier in the chapter, and our Pantheon right now. They look sort of similar, columns, pediment, steps. What appears normal from the facade is actually quite revolutionary when you see it from an aerial point of view. And so here you have the temple as a domed rotunda. Now, rotunda refers to a round building or a circular hall, which is what you have, and it has had a dome placed on it. And we believe that this was Hadrian's idea, to combine that pedimental front part of it with circular form. Absolutely revolutionary. Remember, Hadrian is also an architect, so he's brilliant. He knows how to kind of push the limits of concrete and create these kinds of buildings. All right, the shape of this Pantheon. It is considered the intersecting of two full circles. It's 142 feet in diameter that goes across from one wall to the other wall, and it's 142 feet from the top to the bottom. So you guys, it's not just like a circular walled building with a flat ceiling. The fact that it has a dome allows you to create a circular space in either direction. Really, really innovative and revolutionary. Second bullet, the materials that are used here. Concrete's full potential has been realized. It's the building material, and it's what allows it to shape into these kinds of spaces. And we'll talk about that in just a second with another slide. Other materials we have basalt, we have marble that acts as a veneer, we have travertine and tufa. So a lot of different materials that have come in, but it's concrete that brings it together, concrete that allows this to happen. Let's look at the dome. Now, that center circular opening in the dome is called the oculus, and it's about 30 feet in diameter. That is really big, you guys. Think about that. This place is huge. So 30 feet in diameter, and it's the only light source for the interior. Okay? So, not just the only light source, but whatever's happening outside climactically is also happening inside. If it's raining, it's raining. If it's sunshine, if it's snow, if it's darkness, all of that is also in the interior. And the last point will be the coffers, and I'll show a diagram in just a second, but those are the sunken decorative panels that you can see in the far left slide right there. And they add both an aesthetic quality, but they're also practical because they reduce the dome's mass. Can you imagine if that whole dome was all full concrete with no indentations? Well, with the coffers, you have this lightening of the mass, so it becomes easily incorporated into the powerful, massive sculptural dome. Let's talk a little bit more about concrete. The recipe, right? This is not a natural material that's found, so there is a recipe for it. You're mixing lime mortar, volcanic sand, water, and several small stones. That's where the word cementa comes from. And then once that mix is made, it's placed in wooden frames and it's left to dry. Now, when the concrete is completely dried up, you can remove the wooden frames, the wooden molds, and there you have the shape that you were looking for. So it leaves the shape, the kind of what you were desiring is left behind. And then, because it's not a very attractive looking material, you would cover it with stucco or marble. Okay, so you'd face it or cover it with stucco or marble. So what are the advantages of concrete? Well, you've pretty much seen them already. First of all, it's less costly. It is a lengthy procedure. You've got to mix all these materials, put it in the wooden frames, leave it to dry, and then dismantle it from the wooden frames. Yes, it is a lengthier procedure, but it's much less costly than importing Greek marble or even using the local tufa and travertine. Another advantage, and that's the one that you've seen at play several times, is that you're able to fashion it into amazingly different shapes. Many believe that the Roman builders were actually able to do what they did in architecture because of the use of concrete. So it becomes a vehicle to shape architectural space. And I want to show you what some of these spaces look like. And you've already seen them, but let me just show you what other forms they could take place. And this is what they're able to do. Barrel vaulting, groin vaulting, the fenestrated sequence of the groin vault altogether, or what you just saw with the Pantheon, the hemispherical dome with the oculus. All of this is possible because of concrete. This is a great diagram, kind of the cutout section. So the original form would have had an atrium outside of it, this kind of colonnaded area. And then you see the porch that would have belonged to Agrippa's version of the temple, and then you walk into the domed rotunda. I want to highlight the coffers, right? Those sunken panels on the dome that lighten the mass of the dome. And once again, to point out to the artificial versus natural component of this pantheon. So it's an artificially made structure. It's a man-made structure. But nature plays into it because the oculus is open to the outside. So as I said earlier, whatever's happening on the outside is able to kind of fall into the interior of the pantheon. And because of that, historians recognize this or call this a living system. You guys, it's like living, breathing system. Whatever is experienced outside is also experienced inside. In other words, you're not kind of secluded and restrained from the outside world. It totally becomes part of the experience of what is happening in the interior of the Pantheon. I actually recently came across this photograph, which I just love. You guys, look how small we are compared to the panels. I mean, they look so small from our vantage point, and the photographs never do it justice. But take a look, right? Absolutely stunning. And then the photo of trying to restore it, because you can see the cracks. So, really, in the last century, working very hard to preserve all of our ancient history and ancient monuments. I love this image because it captures that idea of the living system. So you can see the sun kind of just filtering right through the oculus and highlighting just a small section of the walls of the Pantheon. And you can imagine with the movement of the sun throughout the day that that movement of light would also be mimicked inside of the Pantheon. And then these three photographs in the top right is more of a contemporary photograph. You can see it's still doing the same thing. Right? So the way the ancients would have experienced this temple is the same way we can experience it in terms of how it's a living system, with that light just drenching into the interior and then walking its path along the wall that we would have been able to follow with our eyes. And then on the left lower image, you can see us looking up at the oculus. Let's just switch gears just for a moment before we go on with Marcus Aurelius. So what you're looking at is the funerary relief of a vegetable vendor. Now you guys, we'll be looking at imperial art, what the emperors are doing, and the big buildings and the big sculptures and all this iconography that goes with it. But let's be humbled for a moment to look at the funerary relief of a vegetable vendor. He stands there behind his counter. The counter is given to you from a perspective that allows you to see what's on it. He's pointing to some of his goods that he has to sell. It's so modest, it's so raw, it's so simple. And you guys think about our gravestones, what do we put on them? Names, dates, maybe a sentence about who the person was, or the role that he or she played, such as grandfather, father, uncle, brother, and so on. But they are depicting their professions. We don't have that, right? We don't see teacher, doctor, lawyer, mechanic, truck driver, etc., etc. So this is what they're depicting, is pride in what they were able to contribute to the overall society. The image on the right is another one. Can you guess what the profession is here? Sometimes students guess mother, which I agree, it is a tough job. However, here you're looking at a midwife. She's a person who is assisting the woman to give birth. There are actually two midwives in this image, one on the right and then one behind the pregnant woman holding her as she's about to give birth. So we're seeing these kind of little scenes and glimpses of their daily lives depicted as their grave markers, as the funerary relief. And I had to focus in on this because so much of art is always elitist, because it is by art of those who can afford it. And sometimes it's just nice to step down a little bit from that pedestal and look at the humble art of the common folks like us. Hadrian rules until 138 AD, and earlier that year he had actually adopted Antoninus Pius, who at the time was 51 years old. And in fact, because he had seen the value of the succession by adoption, he required that Antoninus Pius also adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as the successors to his throne. So when Hadrian died, of course he was deified. They loved him, so he was declared a god. And then Antoninus comes to power for about 23 years. After his death and deification, we have the first time in Roman history when two emperors are ruling at the same time. So Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus are co-emperors of Rome at this time. We're specifically going to focus on Marcus Aurelius. So here we have it, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. Look at how larger than life size he appears. There is a use of hierarchic scale because if he were to come down from the horse, he would still be relatively quite large. So it wouldn't be kind of a smaller individual next to this massive horse. So there is definitely that use of size to indicate importance. It's a gilded bronze object, possesses superhuman qualities about the emperor. Now that hand gesture, some suggest that he's offering a greeting. Others suggest that it's clemency. In other words, he's about to pardon or forgive or offer mercy to an enemy that may have, in its original moment, been cowering there under his arm and under the leg of that horse that's been lifted up. He looks confident, powerful. This is a horse in motion. All of that is certainly very important. So it is majestic. It is authoritative. It is powerful. It is strong. All of the things that a Roman emperor wanted to convey. However, something happens when you get a closer look at his face. He seems tired, weary, worried, maybe even sad or exhausted. I mean, he looks aged. So the burden of running a worldwide massive empire with tons of territory seems to be weighing in on the emperor. And what we know as further evidence of that are his thoughts that he wrote in what's called now the Meditations. It's a compilation of 12 books written in Greek, and it's just the emperor's worldview. It's his perceptions. It's his sense of what's going on. Because you guys, this is the end of the High Empire. This is the moment when the Romans will realize that they've gotten way too big, right? That drama and territorial expansion, it's starting to weigh heavy on them. And the ruler here, in this case, Marcus Aurelius, is giving us a glimpse into that with the way his face is depicted, but also his thoughts written down for us. I want to share a few of these thoughts with you. So here he says, "Soon you'll be ashes or bones, a mere name at most, and even that is just a sound, an echo. The things we want in life are empty, stale, trivial. If thou art pained by an external thing, it is not this that disturbs thee, but thy own judgment about it, and it is in thy power to wipe out this judgment now." Not a bad lesson to learn, right? And the last one. "Not to feel exasperated or defeated or despondent because your days are packed with wise and moral actions, but to get back up when you fail, to celebrate behaving like a human, however imperfectly, and fully embrace the pursuit you've embarked on." I wanted to end with something that was a little more hopeful, so this is one of those comments. And I put in President Obama here, because in his earlier years when he was still campaigning, as in the image on the top left, he was young, charismatic, dark hair. But what happens after 8 years in office? Notice the images on the right. The gray starts to come in, the exhaustion, the serious expression on his face. So we see it even with our own rulers, right? The weight of governing such a massive territory, such a massive area, is pretty heavy, and the faces and expressions of our leaders show that. And of course, this is very similar to what you've seen with the Middle Kingdom pharaohs in Egypt. Remember the tumultuous, unpredictable, tough times in the Middle Kingdom when they were trying to reassert the imperial power, right? Pharaoh's power. Well, here are the two images we looked at of Senusret III, where it shows the exhaustion, the circles under the eyes, the sagginess, right? The fact that this is a tough job. And he was, of course, we mentioned, more relatable with this kind of a depiction. Just put together a few other images of Marcus Aurelius just for you to see that expression, kind of very introspective expression that he has, the bit of the under eye bagginess and sags, those are common in all of his portraits. Also, you guys, not to forget that he is sporting the beard. So Hadrian introduced it, and then after that it became the norm for emperors to have the beard. And here you have the three from our unit: Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, often also called the good emperors of the High Empire.